Our second speaker is Anjali Gera Roy, Professor of English and Cultural Studies, Indian Institute of Technology, Kharagpur. Her publications include Bhangra Moves, From Ludhiana to London and Beyond. And she has also co-edited Partitioned Lives, Narratives of Home, Displacement, and Resettlement. And she has also contributed to a special issue on South Asian diaspora on Imagining Punjab and the Punjabi diaspora. Anjali Guerra Roy brings her insight into the all too often forgotten and under-researched episode in the story of Komagata Maru, namely its return to the port of Budge, India, and the subsequent tragedy that befell its passengers. Using oral narratives of descendants, Bengali eyewitnesses, and local media archives, Professor Roy's presentation offers a groundbreaking account which foregrounds the perspectives of the Sikh sojourners specifically and Indian colonized subjects generally. Her paper today is When They Refuse to Budge, Komagata Maru's Budge episode. Professor Roy is unable to attend for unexpected family reasons, but she has sent her paper, and her paper will be read by my colleague, Professor Doris Jakobsh. Professor Doris Jakobsh.
I'm so sad that Anjali's not here. She is an amazing speaker and would be able to offer a depth that I will not be able to offer simply in reading this. But she has two, a longer version and a shorter version. And I'm going to read the shorter version, but I thought I should take the introduction from the longer version. I think it will make sense. But before I do that, I just want to say, especially to the students who are here, we're delighted that you're here. And in the presentation that we just had from Dr. Johnson, you saw history at its best, where history comes alive, history grips you. When you're talking about the real people, it's so easy just to think of dates and times and those people from far, far away. And I think he brought something alive and gripping to us, and very few people do it in the manner that you just saw. So take that as an example of a really excellent rendition of doing history. The other thing I want to say is I'm going to be reading Dr. Roy's paper, and if I use a name that you can't catch and you want to look somebody up, just put your hand up, or if I'm not looking at you, just say, excuse me, and I'll repeat the name and you can write it down, okay? So, and that goes for everybody else. And Anjali, unfortunately, when she asked me to do this for her, I found out that her mother isn't well, so I'm sure that she would appreciate our support. Okay, so When They Refuse to Budge, the Budge saga. So this is the introduction from the first, or the longer version, by Dr. Anjali Gera Roy. Almost 100 years ago, a Japanese ship, the Komagata Maru, chartered by Gurjit Singh, a prosperous Sikh businessman from Malaya, which was carrying 376 passengers from Punjab, was not permitted to land in Vancouver on grounds of a stipulation about a continuous journey from the port of departure, and forced to return to Calcutta, where the passengers were fired at, imprisoned, or kept under surveillance. The Komagata Maru has become the site for the contestation over discriminatory policies regulating South Asian migrations to Canada. While Indians perceived it as a violent instance of suppression of the freedom and rights of the loyal subjects of the British Empire, the colonial administration justified its action, alleging that seditious activities were being carried out on the chartered ship. In the absence of authoritative documents, other than Gurjit Singh's account of the journey in English and Punjabi, Sohan Singh Josh's book, and a report compiled by Darshan Singh Tatla, it is almost impossible to conclusively argue whether the Komagata Maru passengers were innocent free workers looking for opportunities in Canada or indoctrinated revolutionaries trained for subversive purposes. Although the Komagata Maru incident has remained alive in South Asian memory in Canada through historians, creative writers, artists, and filmmakers returning to the ill-fated journey to interrogate Canada's celebrated multiculturalism in light of restrictions on Asian immigration and persistence of white racism, the Indian silence on the supreme sacrifice of the passengers commemorated in Sikh memory is due to its imbrication with a form of radical nationalism that has been marginalized to the master narrative of Gandhian non-violence. Discursive engagement with the incident primarily addressed the perspective of the host society's reception of the Sikh sojourners and frame it within debates on Canadian racism and continued instances of discrimination against the South Asian community through legislation related to immigration and employment. This paper revisits the Komagata Maru's journey back to Budge to complicate the history of migration from Punjab beginning in the 19th century and shows that the tension in the drivers for migration ensured that it cannot be exclusively located in the history of labor, military, or resistance. Additionally, it demonstrates that the ambiguity surrounding the incident is exploited not only by the Canadian, but also the Indian state to suit its agendas. This essay revisits the Komagata Maru to complicate the history of migration from Punjab beginning in the 19th century. It borrows Brian Turner, that's B-R-Y-A-N, Turner's theory of enclave society to focus on the paradigm of suspicion in an immobility regime that can offer an insight into the attempts to immobilize the transnational movements of Punjabis, both under imperialism and globalization. Okay, now I'm turning to the shorter version. And the subheading here is Immobility Regime. In his essay, The Enclave Society Toward a Sociology of Immobility, Brian Turner closely examines Urey's notion of mobile sociology in the context of global flows to argue that there is, quote, there is emerging a parallel immobility regime exercising surveillance and control over migrants, refugees, and other aliens. He defines this immobility regime by playing on Ronan Shamir's concept of a mobility regime, which describes the paradox that globalization also produces new systems of closure and develops these notions into a theory of enclave society. By the enclave society, Turner means a society in which, quote, government and other agencies see to regulate spaces and, where necessary, to immobilize flows of people, goods, and services. Defining enclavement as a set of strategies and tactics for both domestic and international regulation, he traces its history in the sequestration in the 14th century practice of quarantine. Although Turner develops this concept of enclave society in the context of globalization, the regulation of spaces by the imperial government and its attempt to immobilize flows of Punjabis through a set of strategies and tactics for both domestic and international regulation makes it fit Turner's definition of an enclave society. This paper revisits the Komagata Maru's journey back to Budge through examining the oral narratives of descendants of Budge Bengali eyewitnesses and local media archives to complicate the return journey of the Komagata Maru. So Budge is the port that they return to, which is, I think, just outside of Calcutta, right? So when they left Canada and headed back. It argues that unlike regulated movements from Punjab that were directed by imperial policies, free movements were immobilized through regulation and legislation in the imperial immobility regime. The rationale of the Komagata Maru journey was to expose the contradictions in the professed freedom of the subjects of the empire to move and work, and the regulations that effectively impeded them through the connivance of colonial administrators in the ports of arrival. So these are subjects of the empire, the British Empire, Punjabis, Indians. The incident foregrounded the irrationality of the logic of migration of British subjects. While they were encouraged to migrate through their recruitment in imperial service, the army, railways, or plantations, they were prevented from exercising their rights to migrate to any part of the British Empire as free workers. The movements from Punjab differed from those in other parts of India in their movements of free workers and the Punjabis' feeling of being entitled to a privileged treatment as loyal soldiers of the imperial army, a feeling that was fostered by the British themselves through their construction of different racial stereotypes. The incident also foregrounded a contradiction that lay at the heart of the empire. It demonstrated the British government's treatment of its loyal subjects. As Johnson points out, that would be this Johnson, the seditious sentiments displayed by Sikhs overseas were in contrast to the loyalty of Sikhs at home and in the service of the army, and Sikh resistance to authority was appropriated by militant movements led by Indian nationalists in San Francisco and elsewhere. While Canada introduced the continuous journey regulation to control the Asian invasion, the British concern with the movements of Sikhs and the Ghadar revolutionaries explained their shadowing the passage of the ship as individual passengers. For those of you who don't know what Ghadar is, it was a revolutionary movement that started in the US and also in Canada in the early 1900s. On its return to Budge, the arrest of its passengers without conclusive evidence of their Ghadar involvement and monitoring of their activities in their home villages for several years shows the domestic, in addition to internal regulations, through which immobility regimes regulate flows of people. The British Indian Immobility Regime regulated the flows of its subjects through a new legislation called the Ingress Act. I-N-G-R-E-S-S, Ingress Act, which gave the British government powers to arrest persons deemed dangerous. The release of confidential material on the British Indian government's list of dangerous persons aboard the Komagata Maru and its plans to arrest them on their arrival in Calcutta justifies the apprehensions Gurjit Singh, who chartered the ship, the Komagata Maru, and his followers had about the actions of the government. Next subtitle is Paradigm of Suspicion. One of the reasons for the rise of enclave society has been securitization, the reason cited by the imperial state to restrict movements of persons who it considered as a threat to the security of empire in the view of the impending war. Turner refers to Shamir's notion of the paradigm of suspicion, quote, in which certain categories of persons are deemed to be dangerous, and hence their movements need to be contained and curtailed. That should sound similar to a lot of what's happening in our society today in the war on terrorism. During the war years, the Sikhs were a category of persons deemed to be dangerous whose movements were followed by the imperial government. The precautions taken by the British to plant agents reporting on the progress of the ship at every port of call, in addition to those at the final destination, confirms the paradigm of suspicion that structured the state's relations with the Sikhs during the period. The assumption behind the Sikhs being regarded as dangerous was that every Sikh was radicalized. The state's actions in the Komagata Maru episode appear to be predicted on the criminalization of law-abiding subjects of the empire through suggesting that they were engaged in seditious activities. The Punjabi narratives of economic and military migration are complicated by the emergence of the militant movement of Gaddar in the Pacific coast in the war years, led by intellectuals in which ordinary Sikhs played a key role. Considering that the Komagata Maru set sail for Vancouver a few months after the formation of the Gaddar Party, with a strong Sikh participation and its consolidation through transnational Sikh networks, and that the war loomed ahead, the British administration understandably felt justified in monitoring the movements of Sikhs. However, testimonies of passengers and Gaddar accounts strongly contest the official documents that presume premeditated acts of violence. The motive of the majority of passengers boarding the Komagata Maru appears to have been economic rather than political. Whether the passengers on the Komagata Maru were committed to the Gaddar cause when they boarded the ship or not, there is evidence to prove that many of them converted to the movement following their internment, and that the incident was appropriated in the Gaddar movement. On their return, they might have been transformed into revolutionaries as much by their contact with Gaddar leaders as by the treatment they received at the hands of Canadian authorities. In other words, they became revolutionaries as a result of the treatment. It is quite possible that the travelers' experience after the discrimination they faced altered their perspectives as it did of the last surviving Gaddar member, Bhagat Singh Bilga, who writes, "We went to earn a living and brought back a revolution," says Bilga in 2009, or the publication was. While his financial worth establishes Gurdit Singh as a person of substance with a strong business acumen and political connections, his motives for chartering the ship are believed to have been motivated as much by philanthropism as by commercial considerations. Yet the financial and personal risks that he took, as well as the strategic moves he makes to ensure the accomplishment of the voyage's objective, betrays an independent spirit and a political will. Gurdit Singh's undertaking of the journey to ascertain if the subjects of the British Empire were equal and could move and work anywhere they wished to owes as much to the older history of Sikh resistance to the British in Malaya, dating back to Bhai Maharaj Singh, as to the new Gaddar movement. There is no doubt that Gaddar networks extended to Hong Kong. Gaddar members in San Francisco were in contact with those in Shanghai, Malaya, Burma, and elsewhere, and communicated with one another at a speed that was astounding in the days of poor or no connectivity. However, while Gurdit Singh might have been in touch with Gaddar members, he does not appear to be an active member prior to the sailing of the Komagata Maru. In a way different and yet similar to his passengers, Gurdit Singh transformed from a shrewd businessman to a highly respected political leader during the course of the voyage, and eventually into a symbol of the transnational political movement for the liberation of India. The records of some of the Komagata Maru passengers indeed confirm their Gaddar leadings. While some leaders like Bhagwan Singh and Barkatullah had addressed the passengers at Yokohama, others in San Francisco and Vancouver were keeping an eye on the ill-fated ship. With the German and British press reporting the incident even before it arrived in Vancouver and the Canadian one reporting it daily after it landed, the Gaddar leaders dispersed across North America were well aware of the developments and sent their representatives to greet the ship. The large sums raised by the Indian community for litigation for feeding the passengers revealed the effective mobilization of the community by the political leadership. The party's investment in the ship and its passengers reveals an amazing network of party workers in a position to assist them at every port of call. It's on the return journey that Sohan Singh Bhakna's involvement through a supply of arms becomes explicit, as does the Gaddar party's open call to arms. The next subheading is the Ingress into India Ordinance. While Canada, am I okay for time? I have 4 pages left, 5. While Canada introduced the Continuous Journey Regulation to control Asian invasion, the British concern with the movements of Sikhs and Gadar revolutionaries explained their shadowing the passage of the ship as well as individual passengers. On its return to Budge, the arrest of its passengers without conclusive evidence of their Gadar involvement and monitoring of their activities in their home villages for several years shows the domestic, in addition to international regulations through which immobility regimes regulate flows of people. The British Indian Immobility Regime regulated the flows of its subject through a new legislation, the Ingress Act, which gave the British government powers to arrest persons deemed dangerous. The release of confidential material on the British Indian government's list of dangerous persons aboard the Komagata Maru and its plans to arrest them on their arrival in Calcutta justifies the apprehensions Gurjit Singh and his followers had about the actions of the government. The Ingress into India Ordinance dated 17 September 1914 that lays down orders for the treatment of persons, quote, not being foreigners who enter the presidency of Bengal by sea or land, which are meant to meet cases known as undesirables, unquote. While the ordinance recognizes that the right to prohibit entry would be inappropriate in the case of British subject, it states that the course is desirable, quote, in order to protect the state from the prosecution of some purpose prejudicial to its safety, interests, or tranquility. The Ingress into India Ordinance, which draws on a similar ordinance against foreigners whose clauses are sufficiently widely drawn to cover every method of restriction, applying in the extreme case to confinement, is underpinned by the idiom of immobility. Statements of British officials reveal that the British Indian government hastily reformulated the Ingress Act to curtail the activities of Gurjit Singh and other Gadar leaders and had a plan of action to detain certain passengers on their arrival, which was not committed to writing. The officers in charge appear to be following the procedure laid down in the ordinance about those arriving by sea by meeting all vessels that are likely to carry undesirables, have an arrangement in place with authorities in the Far East, early warning of any vehicles who might have undesirable persons on board, detain only undesirable persons, and not cause inconvenience to the innocent, the undesirable person. An examination of the reports of the Inquiry Committee, witnesses' statements, and descendant memoirs demonstrates that the state could legitimize its unwarranted actions, such as the search of passengers in the ship, their deportation to their home villages on a special train, the Budge firing, and the subsequent detention only through their criminalization as dangerous elements. The passengers' criminalization is established through unsubstantiated evidence of circulation and possession of Gadar newspapers, alleged presence of Gadar leaders, and delivery of lectures, seditious statements made by Gurjit Singh and other leaders, most of all, the possession of firearms and other dangerous weapons. The elaborate measures taken by the state to detain the returnees ostensibly on the basis of the request made by the ship's captain, Yamamoto, to the British consul in Kobe makes the testimony of the apparently neutral crew of the ship, particularly that of Yamamoto, particularly crucial to incriminating Gurjit Singh and other leaders. A cursory examination of the witness statements reveals that the interrogation of the ship's crew, Captain Yamamoto, first engineer, first officer, and mate, is strongly slanted towards criminalizing Gurjit Singh as a dangerous person through close-ended questions about his antecedents, permission to land in Vancouver, provisioning of the ship, exaction of contribution, treatment of the crew and other passengers, seditious statements and speeches, and the presence of firearms. Unlike the guarded, tentative assertions of the first engineer, the first officer and others about their interpretation of what they witnessed on the ship, Captain Yamamoto's testimony, notwithstanding his ignorance of Punjabi and limited command over English, personal antagonism toward Gurdat Singh, biased sources of information, assumption errors, and subjective interpretation implicate Gurdat Singh and the other leaders in acts that would justify his detention. It is Captain Yamamoto's testimony that is being used to establish Gurdat Singh and others as most dangerous persons, calling for the implementation of the Ingress Act. Captain Yamamoto alleges that Gurdat Singh did not provide adequate amount of food to the passengers, but extracted collections, prevented Ban Singh from landing in Vancouver and the Japanese crew from sailing, fired shots in Vancouver, and asked the captain to procure 12 pistols through his steward, and received a large amount of money from the British consul in Kobe. While acknowledging he had no knowledge of Punjabi and limited competence in English, he claims that Gurdat Singh was extravagant, consumed liquor, used seditious language and speeches on the ship, and confided to him that he planned an armed uprising on his return. He confirms that the newspaper Hindustani was brought into the ship in Vancouver, and that Bag Singh and Rahim instigated Gurdat Singh, that Jawahir Mal and Narain Das boarded the ship in Kobe and made seditious speeches to the passengers, and told him that they were bent on creating a revolution in India, and that 200 pistols brought in a box in Yokohama, which were intended to be used, but were thrown into the sea after the stopover in Singapore. Alleging that the older of two passengers who boarded the ship in Kobe was the most dangerous, and informing him that they were going to have a revolution on their return and create trouble, and the passengers going to riot, he alerts the British consul at Kobe to send a telegram to Kolkata requesting for a guard to be sent along with the pilot. Nowhere does the captain claim to have personally witnessed the alleged occurrences, but to have based his interpretation on hearing about them from passengers who could speak English. Never does the committee keep in view that Captain Yamamoto was himself an aggrieved party, with Gurdat Singh having complained against him as his source, Ban Singh, the leader of the party opposed to Gurdat Singh, and that all his statements are prefixed by the phrase, "I did not see, but heard," or that he had no personal knowledge. The most incriminating bit of evidence about the 200 pistols brought in Yokohama is based on the authority of Ban Singh. So Ban Singh appears to be a rival of Gurdat Singh. Is that right? Anybody know?
Ban Singh was one of the two principal critics.
Okay.
Of one of the passengers and one of two principal critics.
So a biased voice. Unlike the first officer, S. Miyazi, who corroborates Captain Yamamoto's suspicions about the seditious content of the lectures delivered by Gurdat Singh, his revolutionary intents, the two passengers who boarded the ship at Kobe, the number of firearms smuggled in at Yokohama, the distribution of Gadar newspapers, the first engineer, Shiozaki, is hesitant in making categorical judgments and contradicts the captain by stating that no firearms were used against the police in Vancouver, even though other sharp weapons were made on the ship. Unlike the other two, who based their inferences of what they heard, he confesses to not having a knowledge of English and makes a clear distinction between what he saw and what he heard. While he agrees that lectures were delivered after the ship left Kobe by Gurdat Singh and the others, and read books were distributed, he claims to be ignorant of their seditious nature and denies knowledge of passengers being hostile to the government and their intentions of creating trouble. While acknowledging that he heard talks about firearms being brought in Yokohama, he does not confirm the number and places the number of pistols in the passengers' possession to about 4 or 5. Remember, it was 200 earlier. Like Shiozaki, Miyazi, too, does not think that the passengers intended to create trouble on arrival, but claims to have heard that firearms were thrown overboard in the last leg of the journey. The discrepancy in the number of pistols available to the passengers cited by the captain and his crew, and tentativeness in commenting on events that are believed to have transpired, cast doubts on the objectivity of Yamamoto's incriminating testimony. Considering none of them understood Punjabi and spoke English, the seditious content of these statements and speeches made by Gurjit Singh and other leaders may be inferred on the basis of reports of other passengers, often with vested interests. It is clear that the closed questions put to the captain and the crew are designed to establish Gurjit Singh not only as a person of dubious credentials who exploited the passengers for personal gain, and to confirm the intervention of Gadar leaders such as Bhagwan Singh, Barkatullah, Jawahir Mal, and Narain Das. As the British Indian state's action on the passengers' arrival in Budge can be justified only through evidence of the presence of dangerous persons on board the Komagata Maru, the British officials entrusted with the implementation of the ordinance are required to prove the presence of undesirable persons. Based on the suspicions of the Japanese capital, Dr. Raghunath Singh's letter, Ban Singh's word, they set out to meet the ship reportedly carrying 8 undesirable persons and compel the passengers to return home in a special train. The reception party consisted of the Police Commission of Bengal, the Deputy Police Commissioner of Punjab, the District Magistrate, and so on, provides an inkling into the resources invested in intercepting 8 passengers. A number of them confessed having no knowledge of the ship carrying firearms, or active revolutionaries deem it essential to have met the ship because they believed it to carry persons who could be considered dangerous to the tranquility of the country. The elaborate search carried on by the Punjab police does not reveal the presence of firearms or seditious literature. The British officials' perception of certain passengers as undesirable or dangerous is entirely based on biased statements of the disgruntled faction consisting of Ban Singh, Raghunath Singh, 17 Muslims who claim to have been ill-treated by Gurjit Singh. The seditious intentions of the passengers are surmised through the discovery of a Gadar booklet. Their insolent body language and the use of disrespectful Hindi term tu and refusal to board the special train. You know what? I might need a minute and a half. While the officials are determined to establish Gurjit Singh's fraudulent enterprise on the basis of his promise to the passengers that they would be allowed to land in Canada, neither the crew nor the passengers, except the disgruntled few, have any grievances against Gurjit Singh. The genuine fears of the passengers about being taken to an unknown destination and the just intentions to request the authorities to appoint a commission to hear their grievances are interpreted as signs of sedition. The intercepted telegram by Gurjit Singh calling for an agitation on the ship's arrival in Calcutta and unconfirmed information about his intention to begin an armed rising is used to brand him as an undesirable character. Despite the visibility being low and only a small number of firearms being found on the detained, wounded, or dead 6, the British officials insist that the 6 began firing and fired 30 to 40 rounds and that they merely retaliated in self-defense. Not only that, the 6 captured on their way to escape were also alleged to be carrying arms and firing shots. Conclusion. If the passengers' exclusion from the host countries depended on their being labeled as aliens, they were secluded as home as undesirables. Vancouver aliens, India undesirables. A set of laws that allowed states to categorize and track individuals deemed to be dangerous so that they can be secluded. The deportation of the passengers from Hong Kong using the argument of vagrancy and from Calcutta citing their possession of insufficient funds brought the unemployed, the unemployable, or the destitute under the category of punishable behavior. Failing to find concrete evidence of their involvement in seditious act, the state used the war as an emergency to express its sovereignty to exclude undesirables within India. The securitization argument and the objective of defending territorial sovereignty was offered as the rationale for the sequestration of the passengers on their return for several years. A large number of the passengers were imprisoned for several years. Those who willingly returned to Punjab were kept under surveillance. Those who went into hiding were hunted down. The demonization of the Sikh after 1984 and the sequestration of Sikhs, citing the security of the Indian state and a regulation of Sikh movements, reiterates the emergence of an enclave society. The paradigm of suspicion that led to the perception of every Sikh as a terrorist led to the immobilization of their flows overseas. While a number of Sikhs exploited the situation to enter Europe, America, Canada, and Australia as asylum seekers, the grudging citizenship accorded them by host societies and the recent violence against Punjabi migrants that the stranger would continue to be excluded from the space of multiculturalism as he was in imperialism. Thank you.
Thank you, Doris, for reading Professor Anjali's paper.